and that we take good note of what they're saying. So it's not as if what the Secretary of Commerce has mentioned.
We compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
Imagine that one of the United States' strongest allies decides to challenge its patron. Months of tense trade wars, tariffs, and economic pressure lead to the country with which America shares the world's longest peaceful border openly seeking allies elsewhere. A country that for decades has been considered a model of Western democracy and has supported Washington in international politics suddenly finds itself on the path to global change. That country is Canada.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
What happened? How did a country that has been dependent on trade with the US for centuries side with China? And what could this mean for the global political and economic map? This is not just a trade conflict. It is a moment that could change the course of history. Faced with intense economic pressure from the US, the Canadian government was faced with a choice: either submit to American conditions or seek a new path. And that path was found in China, which offered Canada not only economic opportunities but also respect for its sovereignty, which the US could not guarantee. What consequences could this have for the Canadian economy? What does this mean for the US, which has always been considered the world leader? And most importantly, why has Canada's decision dealt such a painful blow to Washington's status on the world stage? China's support in response to US tariffs is not just a trade deal but a geopolitical statement. We have witnessed one country deciding to make fundamental changes to its foreign policy, challenging the old order.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
How will this affect the whole world? What about the relationships between allies who always seem to stand shoulder to shoulder? How will this high-stakes global game end, where not only economic interests are at stake, but also strategic influence on the future of world politics? And what does the future hold when the world is no longer the same as before? And when countries once considered unshakable partners may become competitors? Stay with us to find out how the economic war between two superpowers is destroying old alliances and opening up new horizons for countries ready to walk the path of independence. In this video, we'll look at how Canada decided to change the rules of the game and what that means for the whole world. With the start of trade wars unleashed by Donald Trump's administration, the world has faced a whole new economic order. All the traditional principles of international trade began to change. Under the slogan "America First," the US began to apply new 100% tariffs on Chinese goods, impose restrictions on technology exports, and insist that Washington's allies follow its rules. Key trading partners, including Canada, found themselves in a difficult position. It was a moment when Canada had to make a difficult decision that could change its political course for years to come. It would seem that for a country so closely linked to the US economically and politically, even a hint of a change in foreign economic policy would be unthinkable. However, this was not just a hypothetical discussion, but a matter of survival and preserving economic independence.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
For decades, a crucial part of the Canadian economy depended on close trade ties with the United States. More than 70% of all Canadian exports went to its neighbor. The United States was not just a trading partner, but also a strategic ally with which Canada shared a common border, common values, and common interests. But when the Trump administration decided to impose punitive tariffs on key commodities such as steel, aluminum, wood, and automobiles, these economic ties began to suffer severe strain. The American president claimed that Canada had taken advantage of the US's kindness and should pay for it. This statement called into question not only Canada's economic stability, but also its political security. Trump was willing to do anything to bring jobs back to America, and restore the competitiveness of the domestic economy. But he clearly overlooked one important detail. Canada, despite its dependence on the US, had long been ready to play a more independent role on the world stage. While the American administration continued to increase pressure, providing no clarity in its relations with its partners, Canada began to realize that the moment had come for a decision that would change its future. And that moment turned out to be decisive.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
Canada found itself in a tough economic trap. The decline in trade with the US inevitably led to job losses, exacerbated regional economic problems, and threatened the stability of the country's budget. This was a much more serious threat than simply losing trade revenue. By the time Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, the political climate in the country had already changed. The authorities understood that the decision to continue dependence on the US was becoming increasingly risky. The statistics on economic losses after the introduction of tariffs were shocking. Economists, including researchers from the University of Toronto, estimated that Canada lost more than $40 billion in the first 3 months after the new tariffs were introduced. These losses proved to be an unbearable burden for the Canadian economy, which could not help but react to such drastic changes in its neighbors' foreign economic policy. But this crisis presented China with a unique opportunity. While the US was increasing its trade aggression, China quickly took a strategic position, ready to offer Canada a solution to the problem that Washington had not even considered. Under pressure from American sanctions and tariffs, China offered Canada an alternative: investment, the opening of new markets, and, more importantly, respect for its sovereignty. China did not impose trade rules on Canada, as America did. It offered Canada a partnership based on mutual interests. Beijing was ready to invest in the Canadian economy in areas that the US had ignored: alternative energy sources, technology, and energy. The Canadian authorities realized that the time had come to take advantage of the opening to diversify the economy and strengthen its position in the global market. When the Canadian government decided to hold secret talks with Chinese diplomats, the US reacted swiftly. Rumors of betrayal began to circulate in Washington, and Trump's advisors accused Canada of short-sightedness. Articles began to appear in the American media claiming that this reorientation of the Canadian authorities towards China was a stab in the back for an old ally, and that relations between the two countries could be threatened. Relations between the US and Canada began to deteriorate rapidly, especially when the Canadian foreign minister publicly expressed support for Chinese tariffs imposed in response to American actions. The entire diplomatic and economic atmosphere in Washington changed instantly. This support was seen as an open declaration of Canada's independence from American dictates, and even US allies began to question the safety of working with a country that had decided to so abruptly leave Washington's sphere of influence.
Well, you know, when US officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Meanwhile, a real political storm began in Canada. A new wave of public support for economic independence from the US emerged. However, many opponents of this idea argued that more than 70% of Canadian exports go to the US, which means that a break with America could have irreparable consequences for the country's economy. But such arguments began to lose their force as the government realized that the old methods no longer worked, and that dependence on the US was beginning to be perceived as a weakness. Canada began a transition to a new stage in which the country could develop an independent foreign policy, independent of the US. At the same time, it turned out that the economic threat from America, which had once been a challenge for Canada, had now become an opportunity.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
China, realizing that the situation required delicate steps, acted cautiously. It offered Canada not only to support trade agreements, but also to begin more serious negotiations on strategic long-term projects, such as energy security, infrastructure cooperation, and even proposals for joint investment funds. In return, Canada got a chance to open up new markets and partnerships that could make up for the losses from the US tariffs. Every day, China's support became more and more important. With the US unable to offer Canada the same opportunities as Beijing, it was clear that the time for change had come. When Canada decided to support China in response to US tariffs, this decision became a real challenge for traditional alliances, and above all for America itself. Washington was shocked and disappointed. Before responding, the US began discussing how to quickly and effectively punish Canada for its position. American analysts immediately began warning that such support for China could affect stability in North America by upsetting the delicate balance of power. However, the reaction that was expected in Canada turned out to be different from what many had anticipated. Instead of admitting its mistake or returning to the bosom of the US, Canada responded confidently and decisively, stating that every sovereign state's choice must be respected. In response to criticism from Washington, the Canadian authorities emphasized that they were not obliged to follow instructions from a former ally, and certainly should not act against the interests of their own economy.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
From the outset, Trump and his closest advisors perceived this move as a betrayal. Commentators on American television channels began to stir up a scandal, portraying Canada as a disobedient partner willing to abandon long-standing alliances for short-term gains. Over time, more and more statements appeared. The US actively discussed the possibility of imposing sanctions against Canada, which would send a signal to other countries that wrong actions could have real economic and political consequences. This would have been a serious step toward destroying decades of diplomatic ties. However, in this case, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Washington did not expect that the reaction to such measures would be so profound and decisive. Canadian officials, in turn, began to emphasize that the decision to support China in this context was not just a foreign policy position, but also a matter of national independence. In response to threats of sanctions and sharp criticism, Canada managed to effectively change public opinion within its own country. Disagreements between political parties, which had previously mostly adhered to a position of close cooperation with the US, gradually diminished. At the same time, an internal consensus began to form that Canada could no longer afford to be America's economic satellite. It was important for the government not only to strengthen its position on the international stage, but also to strengthen support among the population. Society responded to this decision, and the percentage of supporters of independence in Canada's economic policy began to grow rapidly. In the early days after supporting China in response to US tariffs, the situation in Canada became quite tense. The economic consequences in the form of a fall in the Canadian dollar became noticeable. There were fluctuations in the stock markets, and the Canadian economy felt the negative impact of reduced investment. However, these short-term problems became a symbol of the struggle for a more meaningful goal. The process of change in the political and economic atmosphere within the country was much more important than all the temporary economic turmoil. Canadian analysts began to argue that, in the long term, independence from the US would help Canada become a more flexible and sustainable player on the world stage. Canada had to demonstrate to the world that, despite its dependence on American trade, it was prepared to take independent steps, even if they led to discontent among its neighbors.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost. They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
At this time, Canada began to actively develop trade relations with China. Beijing, in turn, offered Canada favorable terms for joint projects in the fields of energy, infrastructure, and high technology. At the same time, China began to expand its economic influence in Canada. Chinese companies began investing in Canada's natural resources, opening new production facilities and agreements that created jobs and prospects for economic growth. For example, Chinese investors became interested in developing natural gas fields and supplying rare earth metals, which were extremely important to Chinese industry. These steps helped Canada diversify its foreign trade and improve its economic situation, especially at a time when US sanctions and tariffs threatened to cost it billions in contract. At the same time, growing tensions with the US made it increasingly difficult for Canada to remain part of military and political alliances such as NATO. Washington began to express dissatisfaction with the fact that its closest ally was becoming integrated into the Chinese economic network. This created the impression that Canada was moving away from its old alliance commitments, which in turn posed a threat to security in the region. The Canadian press and political circles began to actively discuss how much the US had changed its approach to its allies. Soon, a reorganization within NATO began, raising doubts about the continuation of a trusting relationship with Canada.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
The eclipse in the diplomatic arena with the US not only led to a significant cooling in relations with Washington, but also made Canada a more attractive target for Chinese investment projects. China, in turn, used this opportunity to intensify its efforts to establish closer economic and strategic ties with Canada. Beijing understood that this alliance could become an important part of its broader strategy to change the global political and economic map. China offered Canada long-term energy supply contracts and the development of new infrastructure projects, which was extremely beneficial for the Canadian economy amid global economic turmoil. The Americans, sensing that they were losing an important ally, began to seriously fear that this would open new opportunities for China on the international stage. Warnings began to sound in Washington that Canada's support for China could be the first step toward a broader reorientation of Western countries toward China. The White House made several attempts to bring Canada back into its orbit, but the pressure did not produce the desired result. In response to growing discontent within the US, Canada had to reaffirm its independence and the need to protect its own interests, even if it meant going beyond traditional cooperation with Washington.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
After Canada strongly supported China, the consequences of this step became apparent, not only for the North American continent, but for the whole world. Washington decided that this was no longer just a diplomatic mistake, but a geopolitical threat that needed to be stopped. The Trump administration imposed new sanctions in an attempt to increase pressure on Canada, including economic and political measures aimed at regaining control over its allies. However, the tougher the US measures became, the clearer it became that the old world order was crumbling and even the strongest alliances could crack. Canada, which was at the center of this economic and political rift, not only withstood the blow but also began to play its own game. The US, trying to maintain its status as a world leader, found itself trapped. Trump's foreign policy, aimed at isolating China, actually led to the economic isolation of the US from its old allies. One of the most alarming signals for Washington was that, after Canada's support for China, many countries began to consider diversifying their trade relations. European countries began to increasingly question whether it was possible to continue to follow the US in its America First policy if it meant ignoring economic interests.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The Canadian economy began to develop new trade routes with China and other Asian countries, creating new sources of income. China, in turn, actively invested in Canada's infrastructure, including natural resource development projects and the expansion of transport routes through the Arctic. The construction of new gas pipelines and energy projects became an important part of the strategic partnership, which received broad support within the Canadian government. Chinese banks offered Canada preferential terms for financing these projects, which contributed to the growth of the Canadian economy amid economic sanctions from the US.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
At the same time, the US faced growing political instability. Leaders who had previously supported Trump's policies began to openly express their dissatisfaction, believing that America had isolated itself too much from its allies. Republican senators said that the strategic isolation of the US could be disastrous for the country. But for Canada, the tougher the sanctions became, the more it strengthened its independence. In pursuit of economic freedom, Canada also strengthened its position on the international stage, and many countries began to perceive it as a leader of a new world order, ready for a more independent foreign policy. The changes within international organizations such as NATO were particularly hotly debated, with doubts beginning to emerge about Canada's future as a member of the alliance. Europe and the UK began to express the view that Canada might no longer be a reliable partner for Western countries. As a result, there was a sense that the global balance of power was no longer built exclusively around the US. Even in the most conservative circles of old allies, there was talk of the need to find a new approach to international relations, where China, represented by its new partner Canada, would play a key role.